The October morning had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle persistence of autumn mist, transforming the familiar village into something altogether more mysterious. Miss Jane Marple paused at her cottage gate, ostensibly dead-heading the last of her chrysanthemums while maintaining an excellent view of the vicarage across the lane. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her 70-odd years, immediately noticed the extraordinary sight that would soon disturb the peaceful rhythm of village life. There, positioned with deliberate precision upon Reverend Clement's doorstep, sat an enormous pumpkin of the most remarkable orange hue she had ever witnessed. It was not merely the presence of the gourd that struck her as peculiar, for October was indeed the season for such things, but rather the careful exactness of its placement. The great pumpkin sat perfectly centered on the worn stone step, its stem pointing directly toward the heavy oak door, as if positioned with a surveyor's care. The harvest festival preparations had been underway since dawn, and Miss Marple had observed the usual parade of villagers carrying contributions to the vicarage. Mrs. Price Ridley had arrived promptly at 8 with her prize-winning marrow, followed by Colonel Bantry bearing a brace of pheasants from his morning shoot. Young Dr. Haydock had contributed bottles of his late father's elderberry wine, while Mrs. Bantry had bustled about with her customary enthusiasm, directing the arrangement of tables on the vicarage lawn. Yet none of them had carried this particular pumpkin, and Miss Marple was quite certain it had not been there when Nell, the vicarage maid, had shaken out the morning mats at 7 o'clock. She had been watching then, too, as was her gentle habit, finding that the small dramas of village life often revealed the larger truths of human nature. Reverend Clement emerged from his morning prayers just as the church clock struck 9, his scholarly face bearing the expression of a man who had wrestled with his sermon until the small hours. His surprise at discovering the pumpkin was evident in the way he stopped short, his prayer book clutched to his chest as he stared down at the unexpected offering. Miss Marple observed with interest as the vicar bent to examine the pumpkin more closely. Even from her position across the lane, she could see his puzzlement deepen as he discovered what appeared to be a small envelope tucked beneath the gourd's considerable girth. The vicar's behavior as he extracted and read the note was most illuminating to her experienced eye. Rather than the pleased surprise one might expect from receiving an anonymous harvest gift, his expression grew troubled, almost fearful. Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed moral guardian, emerged from her morning routine with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece. Her sharp features immediately registered both surprise and suspicion at the unusual tableau before the vicarage. "Most irregular, Leonard," she declared with her customary authority. "In my day, people didn't go about leaving agricultural produce on doorsteps without proper introduction. There are established procedures for harvest contributions." The vicar looked up at her approach, and Miss Marple noted with particular interest how his hand moved protectively toward the envelope, as if he wished to shield its contents from Mrs. Price Ridley's penetrating gaze. This small gesture did not escape the older woman's notice, and her expression sharpened considerably. "I was just wondering about its origin myself," the vicar replied, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor. "Perhaps we should move it to the festival display." But as he bent to lift the pumpkin, something most extraordinary occurred. The gourd, which had appeared solid and whole from a distance, suddenly split along what must have been a carefully concealed seam. The two halves fell away like a great orange casket opening, revealing a hollow interior lined with black velvet. Nestled within this makeshift reliquary lay 3 objects that caused both the vicar and Mrs. Price Ridley to step back in alarm: a small white baby's shoe, pristine despite its obvious age, a pressed autumn leaf, brown and brittle, and most disturbing of all, a gentleman's gold signet ring, its surface darkened with what appeared to be dried blood. Miss Marple had seen enough of life to recognize the significance of such carefully chosen symbols, though their precise meaning remained tantalizingly obscure. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this mysterious message, and she suspected the trouble was far from over. The vicar's face had gone quite pale as he stared at the ring. Good heavens, he whispered, and Miss Marple noticed his hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the objects. "Don't touch anything," came a sharp voice from the vicarage door. Dr. Haydock had arrived for the festival preparations and immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. "This has the look of something the police should see first." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose from within the vicarage itself. Nell's voice, high and frightened, called out from somewhere in the depths of the house. "Sir! Oh, sir! Come quickly! There's been an accident." The small group at the doorstep exchanged alarmed glances before hurrying toward the sound. Miss Marple, moving with surprising swiftness for her age, followed close behind, her mind already beginning to weave connections between the mysterious pumpkin and whatever new crisis awaited them within the vicarage walls. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that elaborate mysteries rarely arrived alone, and something told her that this particular morning's drama was only just beginning to unfold. They hurried through the vicarage's oak-paneled hallway, following Nell's frightened voice toward the study. Miss Marple noted the way Reverend Clement's hand trembled as he still clutched the envelope from the pumpkin, his face having grown increasingly pale since reading its contents. The morning light, filtering through the stained glass window, cast peculiar shadows on the Persian runner beneath their feet, and she observed with her practiced eye that someone had recently tracked damp earth across the usually pristine carpet. Dr. Haydock reached the study door first, his medical training asserting itself as he pushed into the room. What greeted them brought the small group to an immediate halt. There, slumped forward across the vicar's mahogany desk, was Mr. Arthur Liddington, the church treasurer and village land agent. His silver hair was matted with blood above his right temple, and his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled in a way that spoke of violence rather than accident. Nell stood pressed against the far bookshelf, her apron twisted in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I found him just like this when I came to dust," she whispered. "I thought perhaps he'd fallen asleep over the ledgers, but when I touched his shoulder—" She couldn't finish the sentence, instead covering her mouth with both hands. Dr. Haydock moved swiftly to examine the body, his fingers seeking a pulse at the throat before checking the pupils with professional thoroughness. After a moment, he straightened with the grave expression that confirmed what they all feared. "I'm afraid Arthur is dead," he announced quietly. "This head wound appears to have been caused by a heavy object, and from the positioning, I'd say he's been gone for at least an hour." Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself up with characteristic indignation. "Murder in St. Mary Mead. This is absolutely unprecedented. Arthur Liddington was the most respectable man in the village. Who would dare to attack him?" Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her sharp blue eyes taking in details that others might overlook in their shock. The study appeared largely undisturbed except for the tragic centerpiece, but she noticed several telling elements. The church ledgers were spread across the desk in their usual orderly fashion, though one volume lay open to a page marked with red ink corrections. More significantly, she observed that Mr. Liddington's left hand showed a distinct pale band around his ring finger, the kind of mark left by a signet ring worn for many years. The connection to the pumpkin's contents struck her immediately. The blood-stained gentleman's ring lying on black velvet outside could very well have been removed from this very finger. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create that theatrical display, and the timing suggested it was meant to be discovered in conjunction with this terrible crime. "Has anyone else been in the study this morning?" Dr. Haydock inquired, his medical examination complete. Nell wiped her eyes with her apron. "Mr. Liddington arrived just after 8 o'clock, sir. He said he wanted to review the harvest, festival accounts before the preparations began in earnest. He had his own key, you know, for church business. I brought him tea and left him to his work." "And after that?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice carrying the mild curiosity that encouraged confidences. "I was beating the rugs in the back courtyard," Nell replied. "I heard the front bell ring once, but Dennis answered it. Then later, perhaps around 8:30, I thought I heard something fall, but with all the festival preparations." She trailed off helplessly. Reverend Clement, who had been standing frozen since the discovery, seemed to shake himself back to awareness. His grip on the envelope tightened noticeably. "We must telephone the police immediately," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is far beyond anything we can handle ourselves." Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept darting between the dead man and the envelope in his hand, as if weighing some internal struggle. The vicar's behavior since discovering the pumpkin had been most illuminating to her experienced observation. Whatever that envelope contained, it had shaken him considerably, and she suspected it was connected to poor Mr. Lidington's fate. Dr. Haydock was already moving toward the telephone in the hallway. "I'll call Inspector Slack," he announced, "and I'm afraid no one should touch anything in this room until the police arrive." As the doctor's voice could be heard speaking urgently into the telephone, Miss Marple allowed herself to step slightly closer to the desk. Her movements appeared casual, but her observations were methodical. The brass paperweight that usually sat on the corner of the desk was missing, though she could see a faint outline in the dust where it had rested. Near Mr. Lidington's right hand lay a piece of blotting paper with what appeared to be ink stains, though one corner had been torn away in a neat diagonal line. The positioning of the body suggested that Mr. Lidington had been struck from behind while bent over the ledgers. The killer had then removed his signet ring, presumably to place it in the pumpkin as part of their elaborate message. But what message, exactly? And intended for whom? Mrs. Price Ridley's voice cut through her contemplation. "I suppose we should examine that dreadful pumpkin more carefully. Surely those objects must be connected to this tragedy. The baby's shoe, the pressed leaf and the blood-stained ring," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "Yes, I rather think they tell a story, though not perhaps the one the killer intended us to read immediately." The sound of a police car's engine could be heard approaching down the lane, its arrival marking the official beginning of what Miss Marple knew would be a complex investigation. But she had already begun her own quiet work of observation, noting the way each person in the room had reacted to the discovery, filing away details that might prove significant, and wondering about the contents of that envelope which the vicar guarded so carefully. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the most elaborate crimes often sprang from the simplest motives, and that the truth usually lay not in the obvious clues, but in the small inconsistencies that revealed the human heart's capacity for both love and terrible vengeance. Inspector Slack arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man who had learned to expect the unexpected in St. Mary Mead, though his expression suggested he would have preferred a quieter morning. His sergeant, Mills, followed close behind with camera and evidence kit, already preparing to document what promised to be one of the more theatrical crimes in the village's recent history. Right then, Slack announced, surveying the assembled group with his characteristic blend of authority and barely concealed irritation. "Nobody touches anything further. Dr. Haydock, your preliminary assessment stands at approximately 1 hour since death." At the doctor's nod, he continued, "And this elaborate pumpkin display, someone's been reading too many mystery novels, I'd say." Miss Marple positioned herself near the garden wall where she could observe without appearing intrusive, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. She had learned that people often forgot her presence when her hands were occupied with such domestic tasks, and Inspector Slack's methods, while thorough, sometimes overlooked the subtler aspects of human behavior that proved most revealing. The inspector's attention turned first to the split pumpkin on the doorstep, its black velvet interior still displaying the 3 mysterious objects. This baby's shoe, pressed leaf, and blood-stained ring. Someone's sending a message, though damned if the meaning's immediately clear. He lifted the signet ring carefully with his handkerchief, examining its darkened surface. "This matches the description of the victim's ring, I suppose?" "Arthur never removed that ring," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "His father gave it to him 30 years ago. I've never seen his hand without it." Miss Marple noticed how each person reacted to this confirmation. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded with grim satisfaction, as if this detail supported some theory she was developing. More intriguingly, Dennis, the young gardener who had been hovering near the kitchen entrance, seemed to shrink further into himself, his usually cheerful face pale with what appeared to be more than ordinary shock. Inspector Slack's methodical examination of the study revealed several significant details. The missing brass paperweight, normally positioned on the corner of the desk, was the obvious weapon, though a thorough search had not yet located it. More interesting to Miss Marple was the torn blotting paper near Mr. Lidington's right hand, with its faint impression of backward script that her experienced eye could partially decipher. "Tell me about Mr. Lidington's recent activities," Slack demanded, his notebook poised. "Any disputes, disagreements, or unusual behavior?" The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken knowledge. Finally, Mrs. Price Ridley could no longer contain herself. "There had been some discussions about the church accounts, Inspector. Not that anyone questioned Arthur's honesty, mind you, but there were certain irregularities that some of us felt warranted closer examination." This revelation visibly affected the group. Reverend Clement looked genuinely surprised, while Dr. Haydock appeared uncomfortable but not shocked. Most telling was the way the vicar's grip tightened on the envelope he still clutched, his knuckles showing white with tension. "What sort of irregularities?" Slack's professional interest sharpened considerably. "Discrepancies in the renovation fund accounts," Mrs. Price Ridley continued with obvious reluctance. "I had suggested a formal audit at yesterday's church council meeting. Arthur became quite agitated at the proposal, insisting that any irregularities were merely clerical errors he was correcting." Miss Marple observed the ripple of reactions this information produced. The financial motive provided a conventional explanation for the crime, yet something about the elaborate theatrical display suggested deeper, more personal motivations. The baby's shoe, in particular, spoke of old griefs and buried secrets that went far beyond mere monetary disputes. Inspector Slack turned his attention to the vicar, whose internal struggle was becoming increasingly apparent. "Reverend Clement, you've been unusually quiet. That envelope you're holding, I assume it came with this morning's pumpkin display?" The vicar's face reflected the torment of a man caught between competing loyalties. "Yes, Inspector. There was a note inside, along with those objects. I'm afraid it may cast the morning's tragedy in a rather different light." With obvious reluctance, he handed over the envelope. Slack opened it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. He folded the paper back without sharing its contents, but Miss Marple caught his muttered comment, "23 years is a long time to wait for justice." The implications of this cryptic remark sent a subtle tremor through the assembled group. Whatever secrets the envelope contained clearly reached back into the village's past, connecting present tragedy with old wounds that had never properly healed. As news of the murder spread through St. Mary Mead, the harvest festival preparations ground to a halt. Villagers gathered in small, whispering groups, each contributing their own theories and half-remembered gossip. Mrs. Bantry arrived in a state of shocked disbelief, while Colonel Bantry looked utterly bewildered by the transformation of their peaceful village into a crime scene. Miss Marple listened to the growing chorus of speculation with her characteristic patience, sifting through the chaff of rumor for those small grains of truth that might prove significant. She noticed Dennis slipping away toward the back gate, his nervous behavior suggesting he might have witnessed something important. More intriguingly, she observed the way certain villagers avoided eye contact with the police, their body language suggesting they possessed knowledge they were reluctant to share. The physical evidence was beginning to tell its own story. The missing crate from the Women's Institute Hall that could have transported the pumpkin, the unlocked side gate to the churchyard, and the space on a shelf in Lidington's office where a box had been removed, all pointed to careful premeditation rather than a crime of passion. As Inspector Slack continued his methodical investigation, Miss Marple found herself focusing on the human elements that forensic evidence could not reveal. The elaborate symbolism of the pumpkin display, the 23-year timeline mentioned in the note, and the complex web of village relationships that might hide a killer in plain sight. In her long experience, she had learned that the most carefully planned crimes often sprang from the deepest emotional wounds, and something told her that Arthur Lidington's death was rooted in secrets that had been festering in St. Mary Mead's seemingly peaceful heart for far longer than anyone might suspect. Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters in the vicarage drawing room, methodically interviewing each witness while Sergeant Mills continued his careful documentation of the crime scene. Miss Marple positioned herself on the garden bench with her knitting, maintaining an unobtrusive but excellent vantage point for observing the subtle human dramas that official questioning often failed to capture. Dennis emerged first from his session with the inspector, his young face pale and his hands trembling as he fumbled with his gardening gloves. The boy's distress seemed disproportionate to the shock of discovering a crime scene, and Miss Marple's experienced eye noted the telltale signs of someone wrestling with guilty knowledge. "Dennis, dear," she called gently as he passed her bench. "Such a terrible morning for all of us. I do hope Inspector Slack wasn't too harsh with his questions." The relief on his face at encountering a sympathetic ear was immediate. He sat heavily beside her, his usual reserve crumbling under the morning strain. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's been dreadful. The inspector kept asking about the early morning, and I'm afraid I wasn't entirely truthful with him." "Sometimes the truth comes in pieces," she said encouragingly, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "What troubled you about telling it all at once?" Dennis glanced nervously toward the vicarage before speaking in barely a whisper. "I was up before dawn checking the greenhouse heating, and I saw someone near the church wall. They were carrying something large and round. Must have been that pumpkin. But when the inspector pressed me about who it was, I couldn't bring myself to say." "You recognized them?" "I think so, but the light was poor, and I'm terrified of accusing someone wrongly. There was something else, too. A smell when I answered the door later. Carbolic soap, the strong kind. Not what we use in the kitchens." Miss Marple filed this information away, with particular interest. Carbolic soap suggested someone concerned with cleanliness, possibly someone who had needed to wash away evidence. "You did right to be careful, dear. The truth will emerge in its own time." Mrs. Price Ridley burst from the vicarage in a state of considerable agitation, her usual composure thoroughly disrupted. "That inspector is absolutely impossible," she declared, marching toward them. "He seems to think my concerns about the church finances make me a suspect. The very idea is preposterous." "I'm sure he's simply being thorough," Miss Marple soothed, though she noticed how Dennis shifted uncomfortably at Mrs. Price Ridley's forceful presence. "There's something else I felt compelled to share with him," Mrs. Price Ridley continued, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Arthur came to see me yesterday evening after the church council meeting. He was in quite a state, claiming someone was trying to destroy his reputation with false accusations. He kept muttering about old sins coming back to haunt him and how some people never forgave or forgot." This revelation cast the morning's events in an entirely different light. Mr. Lidington had been aware of some threat, some connection to past events that had finally caught up with him. Dr. Haydock approached their small group, having completed his more detailed examination. "The head wound was certainly fatal," he announced quietly, "but there are defensive wounds on his hands. Arthur put up quite a struggle. This wasn't a simple blow from behind. There was a confrontation." Inspector Slack reappeared, his expression grim as he surveyed the gathering. "I found something interesting in the study," he announced. "The blotting paper by Mr. Lidington's hand shows impressions of his final writing. Fragments, but readable. Make it right. Michaelmas, and what appears to be shoe. There's also a torn corner that was found in the rain barrel by the vestry, along with the missing paperweight." Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably. The rain barrel suggested the killer had taken time to wash something, hands perhaps, or the blood-stained ring that had been so carefully placed in the pumpkin's velvet interior. The paperweight was definitely the weapon, Slack continued. Brass globe, engraved with a map of the world. It's been cleaned, but there are still traces of blood. Whoever did this was methodical about disposing of evidence. The inspector's gaze swept over the small group. I'll need to speak with each of you again, particularly about Mr. Liddington's state of mind in recent days. It's becoming clear this crime has roots deeper than simple robbery or random violence. Miss Marple observed the reactions carefully. Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself up with renewed indignation. Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully, and Dennis seemed to shrink further into himself. The pattern suggested several people possessed knowledge they were reluctant to share. As Slack began organizing a systematic search of the grounds, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging picture. The theatrical pumpkin display suggested someone with a flair for symbolism, while the struggle in the study indicated the actual killing had been more desperate than planned. The 23-year timeline, the baby's shoe, the pressed leaf, all pointed to an old grievance finally demanding satisfaction. The mention of Michaelmas stirred a particular memory. 23 years ago, there had been a young woman named Maisie Holt who had left the village suddenly that autumn, amid whispers of scandal and unkind speculation from Mrs. Price Ridley. There had been talk of an aunt in Basingstoke, but Miss Marple had always suspected there was more to the story. The afternoon sun slanted through the autumn leaves as the investigation continued, casting long shadows across what should have been festival grounds. Instead of celebration, St. Mary Mead found itself confronting the reality that old secrets, carefully buried, had finally clawed their way to the surface with murderous intent. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, knowing that the truth often lay not in obvious evidence but in the small human details that revealed the complex motivations driving people to D. The systematic search of the Women's Institute Hall had yielded more than Inspector Slack anticipated, though Miss Marple suspected the evidence raised as many questions as it answered. The cut velvet from the theatrical trunk, the missing pressed leaf from the children's display, and the solitary baby shoe from the heritage collection painted a picture of careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence. Mrs. Hartnell, still indignant about the violation of her carefully organized stores, provided an unwitting revelation as she fussed over the damaged items. That velvet was from our 1919 nativity play, she declared, examining the cleanly cut edges. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for, and the baby things, those came from old Mrs. Holt's collection when she passed on. Her daughter Maisie made most of them before she left the village. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this connection. She had suspected the symbolic objects held personal significance, but the link to Maisie Holt confirmed her growing theory about the crime's deeper roots. The pressed leaf, too, would have come from the Holt family's contributions to the church displays, as old Mr. Holt had been known for his botanical interests. Inspector Slack, methodically cataloguing the evidence, seemed less interested in these historical connections than in the practical matter of access. Who had keys to this hall in recent weeks? He demanded, consulting his notebook. Half the parish, Mrs. Hartnell admitted reluctantly. The harvest festival preparations required constant access. Mrs. Price Ridley for the altar arrangements, Colonel Bantry for the trestle tables, young Dennis for the bunting, and of course Arthur Liddington when he needed to retrieve the church ledgers from storage. The mention of ledgers drew Miss Marple's particular attention. She observed how Reverend Clement's expression grew troubled at this detail, his hand unconsciously moving toward his jacket pocket where the morning's envelope had been secured. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the cut velvet with professional interest, looked up thoughtfully. This was done with surgical precision, he noted. Someone familiar with fabric work or perhaps medical procedures. The edges are too clean for ordinary scissors. As they prepared to leave the hall, Dennis appeared at the doorway, his face pale and anxious. "Inspector Slack, sir," he stammered. "I've remembered something else about this morning. When I was checking the greenhouse heating before dawn, I saw someone near the church wall. They were carrying something large and round, Must have been that pumpkin. And did you recognize this person? Slack inquired sharply. Dennis hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between the assembled group. The light was poor, but I think it might have been a woman. She moved differently than a man would, more carefully, like she was unused to carrying heavy things. This revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the group. A female killer had not been seriously considered, despite the elaborate nature of the crime suggesting someone with domestic skills and attention to detail. Miss Marple found herself thinking of Nell's reaction to the morning's discovery. The young woman had been genuinely distressed, but there had been something else in her expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or fear. If Maisie Holt had indeed been Nell's sister, as village memory suggested, then Nell might possess knowledge crucial to understanding the crime. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Slack established himself in the drawing room to interview Nell more thoroughly. Miss Marple positioned herself nearby with her knitting, appearing absorbed in her work while observing the subtle interplay of emotions across the young woman's face. "Nell," Slack began gently, recognizing her distressed state, "we understand that Maisie Holt was your sister. Can you tell us about her departure from the village 23 years ago?" Nell's composure crumbled immediately. "Maisie was a good girl," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She worked here at the vicarage before me, and she was so careful, so proper, but there were whispers, cruel whispers, after she began walking out with Arthur Liddington." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Arthur Liddington, the respectable church treasurer, had been romantically involved with Maisie Holt before her mysterious departure. "What happened to make her leave?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority that encouraged confidences. "She was with child," Nell admitted, her voice barely audible. "Arthur promised to marry her, gave her his father's ring as a token, but when the time came, he claimed the child wasn't his. Said terrible things about her character. The village took his word, of course. A man of property against a servant girl." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with tragic clarity. The baby shoe represented Maisie's child, born in shame and secrecy. The pressed leaf symbolized the autumn of her disgrace. The blood-stained ring was Arthur's broken promise, returned with interest after 23 years of silence. "Where did Maisie go?" Slack pressed. "London, eventually. She wrote once to say she'd found work and the baby was well, but she never gave an address. I think she was afraid Arthur might try to take the child away, or that the village would somehow find her and bring more shame." Miss Marple noticed how Dennis had grown increasingly agitated during this recounting. His connection to the morning's events was becoming clearer, though she suspected there were still crucial details hidden beneath the surface of his nervous demeanor. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with growing concern, voiced what they were all beginning to understand. So this morning's crime was revenge for an old betrayal. Someone wanted Arthur to face the consequences of his actions 23 years too late. The question that remained was whether that someone was Maisie herself, returned to claim justice, or another person acting on her behalf. Miss Marple had her suspicions, but she knew that patience would reveal the truth more surely than premature accusations. Esperate acts. The weight of Nell's revelation about Maisie Holt's tragic past settled over the vicarage drawing room like a shroud, transforming what had seemed a random act of violence into something far more personal and devastating. Inspector Slack, recognizing the significance of this information, pressed Reverend Clement more firmly about the envelope's contents. "I'll need to see that note in its entirety now, Reverend," Slack insisted, his tone brooking no further delay. "This is no longer a matter of pastoral confidentiality." With obvious reluctance, Clement surrendered the envelope. Slack unfolded the paper and read aloud in his measured police voice. "At Michaelmas, the debt falls due. You took from me ring, name, and child. Now take yours. Leave the pumpkin closed until 9. Justice walks softly. M." He paused, then continued with a frown. "There's something else here, written more faintly at the bottom. There is a second debt outstanding." Miss Marple observed the ripple of reactions this reading produced. Mrs. Price Ridley's expression showed a mixture of vindication and unease, as if her suspicions about village morality had been confirmed in the most disturbing way possible. Dr. Haydock appeared troubled by the calculated nature of the message, while Dennis seemed to shrink further into himself with each word. The appointment was clearly arranged for 9 o'clock. Slack noted, consulting his notebook, which aligns perfectly with our estimated time of death. But this mention of a second debt, that suggests the killer wasn't finished with just Arthur Liddington. Mrs. Clement appeared in the doorway, her usual composure slightly ruffled. "Inspector, I've just remembered something that might be significant. I was at Sim's greengrocer on Tuesday, and I saw a woman purchasing an enormous pumpkin. She wasn't local, well-dressed but not fashionably so, wearing town gloves in October. She asked Mr. Sim very specific questions about hollowing it out cleanly, which struck me as peculiar. She had a distinctly medicinal smell about her, carbolic soap, I'd say. This detail immediately captured everyone's attention. Miss Marple noted how Dennis's already pale complexion grew even more ashen at the mention of carbolic soap, his hands unconsciously moving to smooth his sleeves. "Can you describe her more precisely?" Slack inquired, his pencil poised. "Middle-aged, perhaps 35 to 45. Trim figure, plain felt hat, with the ribbon somewhat flattened, as if it had been packed away. She paid in cash and declined to give her name when Mr. Sim offered to deliver the pumpkin." Miss Marple found herself studying the physical evidence with renewed interest. The precision with which the pumpkin had been hollowed and resealed suggested someone with considerable skill in detailed work. The black velvet lining had been cut with surgical accuracy, and the symbolic objects arranged with an almost ritualistic care that spoke of deep emotional investment in the crime's theatrical presentation. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the evidence more closely, looked up with a professional frown. "The cuts in this velvet are remarkably clean," he observed. "This wasn't done with ordinary household scissors. Someone with medical training, perhaps, or at least access to surgical instruments." Dennis suddenly stood with such abruptness that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I need some air," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "This is all so terrible." As he moved toward the door, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something that made her knitting needles pause almost imperceptibly. Dennis's sleeve bore several small flecks of black material, the kind of lint that clings when handling old theatrical velvet. More significantly, she detected the faint but unmistakable scent of carbolic soap clinging to his clothes. "Dennis, dear," she called gently, "before you go, could you tell us more about your morning routine? You mentioned checking the greenhouse heating. What time would that have been?" He turned back reluctantly, his face a mask of barely controlled anxiety. "Very early, Miss Marple, before dawn, around 5:30. The autumn nights have been cold, and we can't risk losing the tender plants." "And you saw someone near the church wall at that hour?" "Yes, but as I said, the light was poor. I thought it might be someone from the village making an early contribution to the festival." His eyes darted nervously between the assembled faces. "I didn't want to intrude on what might have been a private act of devotion." Miss Marple noticed the careful way he phrased his response, neither confirming nor denying recognition of the figure he'd observed. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that people often revealed more through what they didn't say than through their actual words. Inspector Slack was already organizing a more systematic approach to the investigation. "We'll need to canvass the local lodging houses and hotels," he announced. "If this Maisie Holt has returned to the area, someone will have seen her. Mills, I want you to check the railway station records for the past month. Any single women arriving from London." As the official investigation expanded its scope, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological aspects of the crime that forensic evidence could not address. The elaborate symbolism of the pumpkin display, the carefully timed appointment, the theatrical arrangement of the study, all suggested someone who had been planning this confrontation for a considerable time. Yet the struggle Dr. Haydock had identified, the defensive wounds on Arthur's hands, indicated that events had not proceeded entirely according to plan. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as word of the morning's tragedy spread through St. Mary Mead. The harvest festival preparations lay abandoned, their cheerful decorations now seeming grotesquely inappropriate in the shadow of murder. Miss Marple observed how the village was already beginning to fracture along lines of old loyalties and buried secrets, as people recalled half-forgotten gossip about Maisie Holt's departure and Arthur Liddington's role in her disgrace. As she prepared to return to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that was slowly being revealed. The truth, she suspected, lay not just in identifying Maisie Holt's current whereabouts, but in understanding how 23 years of silence and shame had finally erupted into violence on this particular October morning. The mention of a second debt suggested that the killer's work was not yet finished, and she found herself wondering who else in St. Mary Mead might be harboring secrets that could prove deadly. The evening brought an unexpected development that would shift the investigation's focus entirely. Word came back from Sergeant Mills that a Mrs. Marjorie Reed had indeed taken lodgings at the Blue Boar for 3 nights, departing with sudden haste just after 11 o'clock that morning. Mrs. Finch, the landlady, remembered her as quiet as a pin, neat as a syringe, with the particular cleanliness that spoke of medical training or institutional living. Most significantly, she had brought her own small brown bottle for washing her hands and had left no forwarding address despite paying for the full 3 nights. Miss Marple found this detail particularly illuminating as she made her way through the village in the gathering dusk. The careful anonymity, the medical precision, and the timing all suggested someone who had planned this confrontation with Arthur Liddington for considerable time. Yet something troubled her about the neat conclusion that Maisie Holt had simply returned, exacted her revenge, and disappeared again into the London crowds. Her contemplation was interrupted by Dennis, who approached her near the churchyard gate with obvious reluctance. The young man's distress had deepened throughout the day, and Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the particular anguish of someone wrestling with guilty knowledge. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "I need to tell you something about my mother. She knew Maisie Holt better than I let on this morning." They sat together on the old stone bench beneath the yew tree, where countless village secrets had been shared over the generations. Dennis's story emerged in fragments, each revelation adding another layer to the complex web surrounding Arthur Liddington's death. "My mother came to St. Mary Mead as a young woman with a child born out of wedlock," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The village wasn't kind to her, but Maisie Holt was. They became friends, 2 women who understood what it meant to be judged harshly for circumstances beyond their control." Miss Marple listened with the patient attention that encouraged confidences, noting how Dennis's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. When Arthur cast Maisie aside, my mother helped her leave the village quietly. She kept some of Maisie's belongings, a baby's shoe, a pressed Michaelmas daisy, personal things that couldn't be taken on the journey to London. The connection to the pumpkin's contents struck Miss Marple immediately. "And these items, Dennis? They disappeared from my mother's box a few weeks ago. I thought I'd misplaced them, but now—" He trailed off, unable to voice what they both understood. Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion arose from the direction of Mrs. Price Ridley's villa. The woman's indignant voice carried clearly across the evening air, and they hurried toward the sound with growing apprehension. What they discovered on Mrs. Price Ridley's pristine doorstep made the morning's pumpkin seem almost restrained by comparison. A second gourd, smaller and more crudely prepared, sat split open to reveal its own theatrical display. Inside, on black velvet that appeared to be of cheaper quality than the morning's elegant lining, lay 3 damning objects, a sprig of rue, sharp-scented and bruised, a yellowed newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local Girl in Trouble, Moral Standards Imperiled," and a faded blue ribbon, darkly stained at one end. Inspector Slack, summoned by Mrs. Price Ridley's outraged telephone call, examined the newspaper clipping with particular interest. The letter to the editor beneath the headline, signed "A Parishioner," bore all the hallmarks of Mrs. Price Ridley's distinctive moral rhetoric. Someone had carefully preserved this piece of character assassination for 23 years, waiting for the perfect moment to return it to its author. The accompanying note, written in the same careful hand as the morning's message, was brief but chilling. "Second debt for a tongue that maimed. Justice does not forget. M." Mrs. Price Ridley's reaction was immediate and telling. Rather than fear, she displayed the righteous indignation of someone whose good intentions had been grotesquely misinterpreted. "I defended our village's moral standards," she declared, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. "Someone had to speak for decency." Miss Marple observed the scene with growing understanding. The killer was systematically working through those who had contributed to Maisie Holt's disgrace, but the execution of this second display troubled her. The pumpkin was more crudely prepared, the velvet of inferior quality, and the overall presentation lacked the surgical precision of the morning's work. Dr. Haydock, arriving to assist with the examination, immediately noticed the difference in craftsmanship. "This wasn't done by the same hand," he observed quietly to Inspector Slack. "Or if it was, then in considerable haste." As the official investigation continued, Miss Marple found herself studying Dennis with renewed interest. His knowledge of his mother's connection to Maisie, his access to the Women's Institute supplies, and his obvious distress all suggested a deeper involvement than simple witnessing. The faint scent of carbolic soap that still clung to his clothes, despite the day's activities, raised questions about his morning routine that went beyond greenhouse maintenance. The evening mist was beginning to rise from the churchyard as the crowd gradually dispersed, leaving Mrs. Price Ridley's garden to its unwelcome vigil. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind working through the implications of the day's revelations. The mention of a second debt had been fulfilled, but something about the execution troubled her deeply. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that elaborate revenge schemes rarely proceeded exactly as planned, and the differences between the two displays suggested that events were spiraling beyond the original killer's careful control. The question that haunted her was whether they were dealing with one methodical killer or 2 different hands working toward the same goal of justice for Maisie Holt's long-ago betrayal. The evening brought revelations that would transform Inspector Slack's understanding of the crimes plaguing St. Mary Mead, though Miss Marple had begun to suspect the truth through careful observation of human nature's more subtle manifestations. The second pumpkin's inferior craftsmanship continued to trouble her as she watched the official investigation unfold with its methodical precision. Sergeant Mills returned from the Blue Boar with information that cast the morning's events in an entirely different light. Mrs. Finch, the landlady, had finally admitted what her embarrassment had initially concealed. Mrs. Reed had actually been a young man in women's clothing, his voice and mannerisms betraying his disguise despite his careful preparation. The medical precision of the first pumpkin's preparation, the surgical cleanliness of the velvet cuts, and the distinctive scent of carbolic soap all suddenly made perfect sense. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe Dennis's reaction to this revelation, noting how his already pale complexion grew ashen as the implications became clear. The young man's distress had deepened throughout the day, and her experienced eye detected the particular anguish of someone wrestling with guilty knowledge that had grown too heavy to bear alone. Dr. Haydock's further examination of Arthur Liddington's body provided additional crucial evidence. "I've been reconsidering those defensive wounds," he announced to the assembled group. "There are actually 2 distinct patterns. some from struggling with his attacker, but others that appear to be self-inflicted scratches around his throat area. I believe he was being strangled, possibly with his own pocket watch chain, before receiving the fatal blow. This revelation transformed their understanding of the crime sequence. Arthur had not been struck down immediately, but had endured a prolonged confrontation, perhaps while his attacker demanded acknowledgement of past wrongs. The missing watch chain, the desperate scratches at his throat, and the eventual resort to the brass paperweight painted a picture of justice sought through suffering rather than swift execution. Inspector Slack's inquiries had also revealed that the mysterious lodger had not departed on the London train as initially assumed. Instead, she, or rather he, had taken the local omnibus to Much Benham, specifically to the area near the old midwife's cottage. This destination suggested someone seeking information about old records, perhaps birth certificates or other documentation that had been kept unofficially in an era when such matters were handled with discretion. Miss Marple's gentle interrogation of Dennis finally yielded the confession she had been patiently encouraging. The young man's resolve crumbled under the weight of his accumulated guilt and fear. "My mother kept in touch with Maisie over the years," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not regularly, but she knew about the boy, Thomas, and how hard life had been for them in London." The picture became devastatingly clear as Dennis continued his halting confession. His mother had corresponded with Thomas Reed after Maisie's death, sharing memories and inadvertently detailed information about the village and the people who had wronged his mother. Her letters, meant to offer comfort and connection, had instead provided a blueprint for elaborate revenge. She told him about the church accounts, about Mrs. Price Ridley's letter to the newspaper, about where things were kept in the Women's Institute Hall, Dennis revealed, tears streaming down his face. She was just trying to help him understand his mother's life here, but I think her anger about the old injustices came through in every word. The revelation that Thomas Reed was Maisie Holt's son, now 23 years old and working as a hospital orderly in London, explained the medical precision of the crime's execution. His access to surgical instruments, his knowledge of anatomy, and his familiarity with carbolic soap all aligned with the evidence they had gathered. More significantly, it explained the deeply personal nature of the symbolic objects and the elaborate staging of Arthur Lidington's confrontation. Miss Marple observed how this information affected each person present. Reverend Clement appeared stricken by the realization that his study had been chosen for its sacred significance, a place where truth should be spoken and sins acknowledged. Mrs. Price Ridley's earlier indignation had given way to genuine fear as she understood that her own role in Maisie's disgrace had marked her for retribution. The difference in quality between the two pumpkin displays now made perfect sense. The first had been Thomas Reed's carefully planned masterpiece, executed with the precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. The second, cruder display at Mrs. Price Ridley's house suggested either haste or the involvement of a less skilled accomplice. Possibly Dennis himself, acting out of misguided loyalty to his mother's memory of her friend. As the evening shadows deepened around the vicarage, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that had finally erupted into violence. Thomas Reed had not simply sought revenge, but had attempted to create a ritualistic reckoning, forcing Arthur Lidington to acknowledge his betrayal before exacting the ultimate penalty. The theatrical elements, the pumpkin displays, the symbolic objects, the carefully timed revelations, all spoke of someone who understood that justice required not just punishment, but recognition of wrongdoing. Inspector Slack was already organizing a manhunt for Thomas Reed, though Miss Marple suspected the young man had not fled far. His mission was not yet complete, and she sensed that the mention of a second debt in the original note might not refer only to Mrs. Price Ridley. There were others in St. Mary Mead who had contributed to Maisie Holt's disgrace, and Thomas Reed had demonstrated both the patience and the skill to settle all accounts before disappearing back into London's anonymous crowds. The question that haunted her was whether they could prevent further bloodshed, or if Thomas Reed's carefully laid plans would claim additional victims before justice, his version of it, was finally satisfied. The manhunt for Thomas Reed commenced with methodical precision as Inspector Slack deployed his limited resources across St. Mary Mead's familiar lanes and byways. Yet Miss Marple found herself drawn not to the obvious escape routes, but to the quieter corners where human nature revealed its deepest truths. Her long experience had taught her that elaborate crimes rarely concluded with simple flight, and something in the carefully orchestrated nature of the morning's events suggested that Thomas Reed's mission remained incomplete. She discovered Dennis in his mother's cottage garden, mechanically deadheading chrysanthemums with the focused intensity of someone seeking refuge in mundane tasks. The young man's distress had deepened throughout the day, and her practiced eye detected the particular anguish of someone wrestling with knowledge too heavy to bear alone. The faint scent of carbolic soap still clung to his clothes despite the passage of hours, a detail that struck her as significant. "Dennis, dear," she began gently, settling herself on the garden bench where she could observe his reactions without appearing intrusive. "Such a terrible day for all of us. I do hope the inspector's questions weren't too distressing." The relief on his face at encountering a sympathetic ear was immediate and telling. He abandoned his gardening and sat heavily beside her, his usual cheerful demeanor completely absent. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's been dreadful. The inspector kept asking about the early morning, and I'm afraid I wasn't entirely truthful with him." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, a calming presence that encouraged confidences. "Sometimes the truth comes in pieces, dear. What troubled you about telling it all at once?" Dennis glanced nervously toward the cottage before speaking in barely above a whisper. "I was checking the greenhouse heating before dawn, as I told them, but there was more. I saw someone near the church wall carrying that pumpkin, and later, when I heard voices from the vicarage study, I went to investigate." The confession emerged in halting fragments, each revelation adding another layer to the morning's tragic events. Dennis had indeed witnessed Thomas Reed's careful placement of the pumpkin, but more significantly, he had entered the vicarage study during the confrontation between Thomas and Arthur Liddington. "Mr. Liddington was struggling with someone," Dennis continued, his voice growing increasingly strained. "The young man, Thomas, I suppose, had something around his neck, a watch chain, and was demanding that Arthur acknowledge what he'd done to his mother. Arthur was fighting back, denying everything at first, then pleading when he realized the seriousness of his situation." Miss Marple observed the way Dennis's hands trembled as he spoke, noting the defensive wounds Dr. Haydick had described on Arthur's hands. The physical evidence was beginning to align with this more complex version of events. "You intervened," she said gently, not as a question but as an encouragement to continue. "I tried to separate them. Arthur was turning purple, gasping for breath, but Thomas wouldn't release the chain. In the struggle, Arthur broke free and lunged for the bell pull to summon help. That's when..." Dennis stopped, unable to voice what came next. The paperweight was within reach, Miss Marple supplied with understanding compassion. "I didn't mean to kill him," Dennis whispered, tears now streaming down his face. "I only wanted to stop him from calling the police. Thomas had loosened his grip when I appeared, and I thought if Arthur summoned help, it would be the end of everything. Prison for Thomas, scandal for the village, more suffering for everyone involved. The brass globe was right there on the desk corner, and I just grabbed it and struck out without thinking." The tragic irony of the situation became clear to Miss Marple. Thomas Reed had come to St. Mary Mead seeking acknowledgement and justice for his mother's suffering, but his carefully planned confrontation had been interrupted by a young man whose own family had been touched by similar shame and injustice. Dennis's impulsive action had transformed what might have been assault into murder, complicating both their fates immeasurably. "And Thomas?" she inquired. He was horrified when Arthur fell, kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen that way, that he only wanted him to admit the truth and apologize. He helped me clean up, took Arthur's ring as he'd planned, but everything had gone wrong. Dennis looked up at her with desperate eyes. "He's not a murderer, Miss Marple. Not really. That was me." The complexity of the situation troubled Miss Marple deeply. Two young men, both driven by loyalty to wronged women from previous generations, had become entangled in a tragedy that neither had fully intended. Thomas's elaborate revenge had been derailed by Dennis's protective instincts, creating a shared culpability that would be difficult for any court to untangle. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple reflected on the human elements that forensic evidence could never fully capture. The morning's crime had indeed been rooted in old injustices, but its actual execution had involved the collision of two separate missions of justice, each driven by love and loyalty, each resulting in consequences far beyond what either young man had anticipated. The question that remained was whether Thomas Reed, still at large and, presumably aware that his original plan had been catastrophically altered, would attempt to complete his mission of revenge or recognize that events had already spiraled beyond any possibility of the justice he had originally sought. Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay not in police searches, but in understanding the psychological state of a young man whose carefully constructed plan for retribution had collapsed into something far more tragic and morally ambiguous than he had ever intended. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous moments often came not during the commission of planned crimes, but in their chaotic aftermath, when desperate people made increasingly desperate choices in their attempts to salvage meaning from tragedy. The weight of Dennis's confession settled over Miss Marple like a familiar burden, one she had carried many times before when human nature revealed its capacity for both loyalty and tragic misjudgment. She understood now that the morning's elaborate crime had been the collision of two separate missions of justice, each driven by love for wronged women, each resulting in consequences far beyond what either young man had anticipated. The question that remained was how to bring Thomas Reed back to face the truth of what his carefully orchestrated revenge had actually accomplished. As she walked slowly back toward the village center, Miss Marple's experienced mind was already formulating a plan that relied not on police dragnet or official procedures, but on her deep understanding of human psychology and the particular vulnerabilities of a young man whose grand design had collapsed into accidental murder. Thomas Reed was not a hardened criminal, but an intelligent, methodical person who had spent months planning what he believed would be a moment of perfect justice. The reality of Arthur Lidington's death, achieved through Dennis's desperate intervention rather than his own calculated confrontation, would be eating at him like acid. She made her way to the churchyard, where the ancient headstones bore witness to generations of village secrets and sorrows. Here, among the weathered monuments to the Holt family, she suspected Thomas might seek the solace that only proximity to his mother's memory could provide. Miss Marple positioned herself near the grave of Maisie's mother, carrying a small bunch of Michaelmas daisies, the same flowers that had been pressed and placed in the morning's theatrical display. The symbolism was deliberate, and she knew Thomas would recognize it immediately. She settled herself on the stone bench that overlooked the family plot, her knitting bag beside her, and began the patient waiting that had served her so well in previous investigations. In her long experience, people driven by profound emotional need eventually gravitated toward the places that held meaning for them, especially when their carefully constructed plans had collapsed into chaos. The eyes, morning mist was beginning to lift when she detected movement among the yew trees. Thomas Reed emerged from the shadows with the cautious gait of someone who had been watching for some time before deciding to approach. His face bore the haggard expression of a man who had not slept, and Miss Marple noted the telltale tremor in his hands that spoke of nervous exhaustion rather than fear. "Good morning," she said gently, looking up from her knitting with the mild surprise of someone encountering an unexpected but not unwelcome visitor. "Such a peaceful spot, isn't it? I often come here when I need to think clearly about difficult matters." Thomas stopped near his grandmother's headstone, his eyes immediately drawn to the Michaelmas daisies she had placed there. The recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been relief at finally encountering someone who understood the significance of his symbolic choices. "You know who I am," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and suppressed emotion. "I know you're Maisie Holt's son," Miss Marple replied with gentle directness, "and I know you came to St. Mary Mead seeking justice for a terrible wrong done to your mother 23 years ago. What I'm less certain about is whether you found what you were looking for." Thomas's composure began to crack under her understanding gaze. "It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did," he whispered, sinking onto the grass beside the grave. "I'd planned everything so carefully. The pumpkin, the symbols, the appointment at 9 o'clock, all of it was meant to force him to acknowledge what he had done before facing the consequences." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she encouraged him to continue. "But someone else was there, someone who changed everything." "The young gardener," Thomas nodded, tears now flowing freely down his face. "I had Arthur by the throat with his own watch chain, demanding that he admit the truth about my mother, about me. He was finally beginning to break, to confess when this other young man appeared. He tried to separate us. And in the confusion, Thomas's voice broke completely. Arthur broke free and reached for the bell pull. Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes. And Dennis, that's his name, isn't it? Grabbed the paperweight without thinking. I saw the horror in his eyes when Arthur fell. He never meant to kill anyone, just as I never meant for it to end in death. We were both trying to protect people we loved, and instead we created this terrible tragedy." Miss Marple observed the genuine remorse in Thomas's demeanor, the way his shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, and the careful way he touched his grandmother's headstone as if seeking forgiveness from the dead. This was not the behavior of a calculating murderer, but of a young man whose quest for justice had been transformed into something he could barely comprehend. "The second pumpkin at Mrs. Price Ridley's house," she noted quietly. "That was your work as well?" Thomas nodded miserably. "I felt I had to complete what I'd started, to honor my mother's memory by confronting everyone who had wronged her. But my heart wasn't in it anymore. The precision was gone, the purpose corrupted by what had happened in the vicarage study." As the church bells chimed 9 o'clock, exactly 24 hours after Arthur Lidington's death, Miss Marple made her decision about how this tragic story should conclude. Miss Marple rose from the stone bench with the quiet authority that had served her so well in previous investigations, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from understanding human nature's deepest complexities. "Come along, Thomas," she said gently, extending her hand toward the grieving young man. "There are people who need to hear the truth, and it must be told properly, with compassion for all involved." They walked together through the village lanes, past the abandoned harvest festival preparations that seemed grotesquely inappropriate in the shadow of tragedy. Miss Marple observed how Thomas carried himself with the exhausted dignity of someone who had finally unburdened himself of a terrible secret, though she knew the hardest part of his ordeal was yet to come. At the vicarage, Inspector Slack was coordinating his search efforts with characteristic brusqueness, his frustration evident as each lead proved fruitless. Miss Marple's arrival with Thomas Reed brought an immediate halt to the proceedings, though she noted with approval that the inspector's surprise quickly gave way to professional competence. "Mr. Reed, I presume," Slack said, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs. "You've saved us considerable trouble by surrendering yourself." "Actually, Inspector," Miss Marple interjected with her characteristic mildness, "I think you'll find the situation rather more complex than simple surrender. If you could gather everyone in the study, Dennis particularly, I believe we can resolve this matter with the clarity it deserves." Within minutes, the vicarage study had become an impromptu courtroom, with the principal players assembled around the desk where Arthur Lidington had met his tragic end. Dennis arrived last, his face bearing the haunted expression of someone who had spent sleepless hours wrestling with guilt and fear. Miss Marple positioned herself near the window, her knitting bag at her side, and began with the gentle authority that had solved so many village mysteries. We have here 2 young men, each driven by loyalty to women who suffered great injustices in this very village 23 years ago. Thomas Reed came to St. Mary Mead seeking acknowledgement of the wrong done to his mother, Maisie Holt. His plan was elaborate, theatrical, and carefully designed to force Arthur Liddington to confess his betrayal before facing consequences. She gestured toward the desk where the morning's tragedy had unfolded. The pumpkin display, the symbolic objects, the appointed time, all were meant to create a moment of perfect justice. Thomas used Arthur's own watch chain not to kill, but to compel confession. He had medical training enough to know where pressure could frighten without causing death. Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly grave as Miss Marple continued her reconstruction. But human plans rarely unfold as intended. Dennis, motivated by his own family's experience with village shame and his mother's friendship with Maisie, witnessed the confrontation and misunderstood its purpose. Dennis's face crumpled as she turned her gentle gaze upon him. You saw Arthur reaching for the bell pull and believed he was summoning help that would destroy any chance of justice. The brass paperweight was within reach, and you acted without thinking, striking the blow that ended Arthur's life. It's true, Dennis whispered, his voice barely audible. I never meant to kill him. I only wanted to stop him from calling the police. Thomas was so close to getting the acknowledgement his mother deserved. Thomas looked up with tears streaming down his face. I wanted him to say her name without shame, to admit what he had done. When Dennis struck him and Arthur fell, I knew everything had gone wrong. We cleaned up together, and I took the ring as I had planned, but the justice I sought had become something terrible. Miss Marple observed the genuine remorse in both young men's faces, the way their shared tragedy had bound them together in guilt and sorrow. The second pumpkin at Mrs. Price Ridley's house was your attempt to complete your original mission, Thomas, but your heart was no longer in it. The craftsmanship was cruder, the purpose corrupted by what had happened here. Inspector Slack, who had been listening with professional attention, finally spoke. So we have one young man planning elaborate revenge and another committing accidental murder while trying to help. The law will have to sort out the degrees of culpability. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, but I hope it will do so with understanding of the human motivations involved. Neither of these young men is a hardened criminal. They are products of old injustices that were never properly addressed, wounds that festered in silence until they erupted into tragedy. As Inspector Slack prepared to make his arrests, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of loyalty, love, and misguided justice that had led to this moment. The elaborate symbols, the careful timing, the theatrical presentation, all had been designed to create meaning from suffering, but had instead created only more pain. The handcuffs clicked with quiet finality as both young men were taken into custody, their shared burden of guilt now a matter for courts and lawyers to untangle. Miss Marple remained in the study after the others had gone, her eyes resting on the desk where tragedy had transformed careful plans into accidental murder, knowing that true justice would require not just legal proceedings, but a village's willingness to confront the old cruelties that had made such desperate measures seem necessary. The quiet that settled over St. Mary Mead following the arrests carried a weight that the village had never before experienced, transforming the familiar lanes and gardens into something altogether more somber and reflective. Miss Marple remained in the vicarage study long after Inspector Slack had departed with his prisoners, her pale blue eyes resting thoughtfully on the desk where tragedy had transformed careful plans into accidental murder. The abandoned harvest festival preparations bore witness to the morning's revelations, their cheerful decorations now seeming grotesquely inappropriate in the shadow of such profound human sorrow. Mrs. Bantry moved through the dismantling process with uncharacteristic silence, her usual enthusiasm replaced by the sobering recognition that their peaceful village harbored depths of pain and resentment that had festered unexamined for decades. Mrs. Price Ridley emerged from her villa with an expression Miss Marple had never before witnessed on those sharp features, genuine uncertainty about her own moral authority. The second pumpkin's symbolic reproach had forced her to confront her role in Maisie Holt's disgrace, and the yellowed newspaper clipping with its damning headline served as an uncomfortable mirror reflecting her own capacity for cruelty disguised as righteousness. Miss Marple, she approached hesitantly, her usual imperious manner completely absent. I find myself wondering whether my concern for village standards might have contributed to this terrible tragedy. That letter to the editor, all those years ago, I believed I was protecting our community's moral fabric. We all act according to our understanding at the time, Miss Marple replied gently, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The tragedy lies not in individual failings, but in our collective unwillingness to examine the consequences of our judgments. Maisie Holt paid a terrible price for the village's moral certainty, and that debt finally came due in the most devastating way possible. Reverend Clement found her later in the churchyard, his scholarly face bearing the weight of spiritual responsibility for his flock's failings. I keep thinking about those young men, he confessed, settling beside her on the stone bench. Thomas Reed, driven by love for a mother he barely knew, seeking acknowledgement of an injustice that shaped his entire existence, and Dennis, acting from loyalty to his own family's experience of shame and exclusion. Neither was truly evil, yet both are now facing the consequences of actions that spiraled beyond their control. Miss Marple observed the genuine anguish in his expression, recognizing the particular burden carried by those who minister to human souls. The law will determine their fate, according to statutes and precedents, she said thoughtfully. But human nature operates by more complex principles. Thomas's elaborate revenge was designed to create meaning from suffering, to force recognition where none had been given. His mistake was believing that justice could be achieved through theatrical confrontation rather than genuine understanding. The evening light cast long shadows across the village green as Miss Marple made her way home, passing the cottage where Dennis's mother had once corresponded with Maisie Holt, sharing memories that inadvertently provided the blueprint for elaborate revenge. The irony was not lost on her that letters meant to offer comfort and connection had instead fueled a young man's quest for retribution. In her sitting room, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's events with the philosophical detachment that came from decades of observing human nature's infinite capacity for both love and destruction. The pumpkin's symbolic objects, the baby's shoe, the pressed leaf, the blood-stained ring, had been carefully chosen to tell a story of betrayal and loss, but their theatrical presentation had ultimately obscured rather than illuminated the truth. The real tragedy lay not in Arthur Lidington's death, deserved though it might have seemed to those who knew of his betrayal, but in the waste of 2 young lives consumed by loyalty to wounds they had inherited rather than inflicted. Thomas Reed's medical precision, his careful planning, his elaborate symbolism, all had been undone by a moment of impulsive protection from someone who understood too well the pain of being judged harshly by village standards. As the church bells chimed the evening hour, Miss Marple considered how the disrupted harvest festival had become an unintended metaphor for the village itself. What should have been a celebration of abundance and community had instead revealed the scarcity of forgiveness and the long reach of unexamined cruelties. The decorations would be stored away until next year, but the memory of this October morning would linger far longer in the collective consciousness of St. Mary Mead. The village would heal, as villages always do, with new gossip eventually displacing old scandals and the rhythms of daily life resuming their gentle persistence. But Miss Marple knew that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of themselves and their capacity for both kindness and casual cruelty. The pumpkin left on the vicar's doorstep had been more than an elaborate calling card. It had been a mirror reflecting 23 years of willful blindness to the consequences of their moral certainties. In her long experience of human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most profound mysteries were not those of hidden identities or concealed weapons, but of the human heart's ability to transform love into vengeance and loyalty into tragedy. As she prepared for sleep, she reflected that true justice lay not in elaborate revenge or legal proceedings, but in the quiet recognition that every action ripples outward through time, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, creating debts that someday, somehow, must always be paid.